Good morning. They tell a story about a fellow who goes to a psychiatrist, a therapist, and he says, I can't sleep at night because I have these fears that there are monsters under my bed and I'm frightened all night long. What should I do? And the therapist says to him, listen, you have a very serious phobia. It's a result of maybe trauma from your childhood. You need to come to therapy. And after years of therapy, God willing, will cure you from your fears and your phobias. The fellow says, how often do I have to come? He says, you have to come twice a week for 3 years. He says, how much is each session? He said, each session is $300. The guy leaves the office, never comes back. A few weeks later, the therapist is walking in the street and he sees this fellow. He says, you never came back. What happened with your phobias and your fears of the monsters underneath your bed? He said, I'm all cured from it. He said, you're all cured? What did you do? He said, I went to my rabbi and one meeting, he took care of it. He said, really? What did the rabbi tell you? He says, the rabbi told me to cut off all the legs of my bed. So now there are no more monsters. They can't get under my bed anymore. Sometimes we live with fears, phobias, insecurities, anxieties. This week's parsha teaches us a very powerful lesson about how to deal with fear and insecurity. This week's Torah portion contains the first 7 of the 10 plagues that Moshe Rabbeinu brought upon Egypt through God's command to break Pharaoh and the Egyptian persecution and enslavement of the Jews. But we find something fascinating. There is this stick or this staff that plays a major role in the entire story. At the very inception, when God came to Moshe at the burning bush, and Moshe said, how am I going to prove to Pharaoh that I am your messenger? God says to Moshe, what is that in your hand? He says, a staff. He says, throw it on the ground. Moshe throws it on the ground and it turns into a snake. And the Torah says Moshe runs away from the snake. He's afraid. And God says, grab a hold of the snake at its tail. And sure enough, it turns back into a staff. And God says to Moshe, when you go to Pharaoh, you will perform this miracle before him. Take the stick with you. Throw it to the ground and it will turn into a snake, and you will prove to them that you are my messenger. But we all know what happens when Moshe goes to Paro. Paro says, I'm not impressed. I have magicians who could do the same thing. And sure enough, they throw their staffs to the ground and it turns into snakes. But however, after they turn their snakes back into staffs, the Torah says that the staff of Moshe swallowed up all the staffs of all the magicians. And this was the first miracle of proof to Pharaoh that Moshe was a messenger of Hashem. But sure enough, when the 10 plagues begin and God tells Moshe, go to the Nile and stretch out your hand, take your staff that you performed the miracles before Pharaoh with, and stretch that staff over the Nile and it will turn to blood. And throughout all the 10 plagues, this staff plays a pivotal role. So much so that when the Jewish people finally go out of Egypt and they're about to cross the Nile River, what does God say to Moshe? Take the staff, that one and only staff that performed all the miracles, and it will perform the ultimate miracle. Stretch it over the Nile and of course the Red Sea, and of course the Red Sea split, and the Jewish people passed through, and the Egyptians were drowned. And the question is, God could have performed many miracles, and God could have just performed miracles the way magicians do it, abracadabra, and everything happens. The sea splits, the water of the Nile turns into blood. What is the message of this staff, and the staff turning into a snake, and then the snake turning back into a staff? And all you have to do is go back to the original story in the Torah in the Garden of Eden, which was also about a snake. What does a staff represent, and what does a snake represent? And what is the message of a staff as it pertains to the role of a leader? What the Torah is telling us is as follows. What is the difference between a staff and a snake? A staff is something you lean on. It's reliable, it's dependable. Leadership is about being solid, being able to be reliable and dependable, that others can lean on you because you are a leader, like a staff. However, the difference between a staff and a snake is that obviously a staff is straight. A snake is always slithering. It's always zigzagging from left to right, right to left, and therefore it's venomous and it's poison. And what the Torah is teaching us is a very powerful lesson about leadership. That to be a leader means that you are strong. To be a leader means that people could lean on you and rely on you. You know why? Because you're always straight. You're always honest. You're always truthful. You always have integrity and character in everything you do. And therefore they know that you're dependable, because you're always going to do what is right, what is just, what is moral, and what is ethical. But the snake represents the type of a leader who is always zigzagging, who is always just doing whatever is in their best personal interest, not in the best interest of the people. And unfortunately, such leadership that is always moving in one direction and the other, and has no internal values or principles or character to guide it, it's not firm and straight, that is the type of a leadership that is like a snake that you can never lean on or rely on. On the contrary, it is venomous and it is poison. And that's why when you go back to the initial story in the Garden of Eden, the snake represents sin, represents the temptations of life that sometimes lead us astray and does not allow us to follow our inner moral compass of being truthful, of being godly, of being connected to Hashem, of being able to always do what is right, what is straight, what is proper. There's a former member of Knesset, his name is Rabbi Dov Lipman, and he posted on his Instagram the following story. Natan Sharansky was one of the greatest refuseniks, and of course he sat in the Soviet Gulag for many years in prison for his desire to go to Israel. And he wrote a memoir based on the verse in Tehillim, which is fear no evil. Psalm 23 says, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, lo ira ra, I will not fear no evil, ki atah imadi, because you are with me. And the story of Natan Sharansky was, of course, that for 9 years he sat in Siberia and gulags in Russia, but he always had with him a little Tehillim that his wife Avital had sent him. And he would recite the Psalms day in, day out, and that's what gave him the strength, gave him the hope, gave him the faith to survive that ordeal. And there are many stories about this little book of Psalms. Often they confiscated it from him. He went on a hunger strike to get it back, and so much so that when he was finally released and allowed to go to Israel, where he eventually became a member of the Knesset and a cabinet member in the Israeli government, realizing his dream to go home to Yerushalayim, to Israel, and be with his wife. And of course, he managed to succeed in doing that, and now ran the Sochnut for many years, the Jewish agency. When he left, they took away his Tehillim. And before he boarded the plane to Israel, he said, I want my Tehillim back and my book of Psalms, and they wouldn't give it to him. And he lay down in the freezing cold snow in Russia and said, I will not get on this plane, as the whole world was watching. And he said, I will not get on this plane till you give me back my book of Psalms. And they were forced to give him back his little book of Psalms that his wife had sent him when he went off to prison, and he carried it on the plane and brought it to Israel. And so Rabbi Dov Lipman said he was in the bakery in Jerusalem this week, and he realized Natan Sharansky is standing right in front of him online. And so he summons up the courage, he says, and he says to him, hi, my name is Rabbi Dov Lipman. So I want you to know I gave a class this week on the book of Psalms, and I told the story of your little book of Tehillim that you had with you, that you recited each and every day throughout your imprisonment. And he says Natan Sharansky reached into his shirt pocket and took out a little Tehillim, and he showed it to him. And Dov Lipman shows a picture of this little tattered Tehillim book, the very book that he had with him throughout all of his years in the Gulag. And Rabbi Dov Lipman writes that he said to him, do you carry this Tehillim with you wherever you go? And Natan Sharansky said, no, actually it carries me. Every person needs a staff that carries them throughout life, and that is their integrity, their values, their character, their truth, their connection to Torah, to mitzvahs. That is our staff, the little book of Psalms that we could always rely on, because truth ultimately prevails. And that's why ultimately the staff consumes the snake and transforms it into a staff, because when we know that goodness, righteousness, and truth is stronger and reliable and dependable and will always prevail, just like Natan Sharansky prevailed over the KGB officers, and he went on to become a minister in the Israeli government and lives his dream of living in Eretz Yisrael, while the KGB collapsed, so too all of falsehood is only an illusion. all the fears, all the insecurities is not real. It's just a phobia. What is real and what is true is the staff that God gives us and says, take this with you in your hand, and with it you will be able to perform all sorts of miracles. And even when there is a Pharaoh standing in your way, or there is a sea standing before you, the staff will overcome the hardness of the pharaohs and split all the seas in your life, and ultimately goodness, righteousness, and truth will prevail. Have a wonderful day.